I'll give you the plane if you can fly. Thomas Whitmore's laughter echoed through the private hangar like a thunderclap of derision as he pointed at the 62-year-old black woman standing silently before the gleaming $20 million Cessna Citation X+. Deborah Williams, her calloused hands clutching a worn plastic bag under the halogen lights of the Miami hangar, stood motionless in her threadbare coat, a stark contrast to the Italian suits of the businessmen attending the sales demonstration. As she approached to admire the cockpit, Whitmore, heir to an oil fortune and owner of a fleet of aircraft, sneered at her presence among millionaire buyers. "Look at that," he said, gesturing theatrically. "You must be lost. This isn't exactly the kind of place where people like this usually hang out." Laughter erupted as middle-aged men with Rolex watches and women dripping in designer jewelry treated her humiliation like scheduled entertainment, while Jennifer, the saleswoman, discreetly signaled for security. But Deborah scanned the jet with a practiced eye, her fingers nearly brushing the fuselage, murmuring softly, 47 years. Whitmore scoffed, asking whether she meant her age or the time it would take her to understand a real plane, provoking another round of laughter. Still, her eyes burned with a dangerous calm, and she repeated firmly, 47 years flying. The room fell silent, then exploded in louder mockery as Whitmore doubled over, convinced she was joking. But her serenity unsettled the crowd. It was the confidence of someone holding secrets too powerful to waste on anger. "If you're so sure I can't fly," she challenged, her voice steady, "why not make your joke interesting?" The hangar froze, the air thick with disbelief as the woman who should have slunk away in shame instead confronted one of Miami's richest men, silencing him in front of witnesses. For the first time, Whitmore faltered, his laughter masking unease as he struggled to respond while Deborah stood in quiet defiance, her silence heavy with unspoken promises. The crowd stirred, unsure whether they had just witnessed a spectacle or the beginning of something none of them could control, while Whitmore forced more laughter, mocking, 47 years flying. Maybe she's been counting since the city bus. His taunts drew renewed laughter, and another tycoon, Richard Blackstone, snapped a photo, muttering, "This is going viral." Beggar claims to be a pilot at a $20 million event. Jennifer whispered nervously to security, but Whitmore waved it off with theatrical delight. "No, no," he said, grinning maliciously. "Let her stay. I want to see where this goes." Deborah remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the $20 million Cessna Citation X+, as Thomas Whitmore's smirk faltered when she repeated, 47 years, her voice carrying a weight that unsettled the room. A flashback pierced her mind. 17 years old, the only black woman in her 1976 flight class, doubted by instructors, mocked by peers, yet proving herself in the skies. Now, in this Miami hangar, the same flame burned in her gaze. Marcus Stevens, an older businessman, tried to intervene, but Deborah cut him off gently. "Mr. Whitmore made me an offer. I'm considering it." The air shifted from cruel amusement to astonishment as she declared she would accept the challenge. Thomas stammered, disbelief cracking his authority, while she calmly reminded him of his promise. He protested it was a joke, but she turned to the audience, gesturing at their contracts worth millions, and asked if men of such wealth weren't also men of their word. Jennifer, the saleswoman, swallowed nervously as Richard Blackstone filmed gleefully, expecting viral humiliation, but Deborah rattled off the jet's specifications with flawless precision, silencing the room. It was no bluff, no YouTube trivia. It was the reflex of a professional. "The question," she said, stepping toward the aircraft, "is whether you have the courage to honor your word when you realize you've underestimated me." Thomas, cornered by his arrogance, demanded that when she failed she would kneel and apologize. "Deal," Deborah replied firmly, countering that if she succeeded, he would sign the transfer of ownership on the spot. His laughter rang false, but he agreed, desperate to salvage control. Jennifer whispered a warning, but Deborah's calm smile dismissed it. Some battles had to be fought regardless of consequences. Her movements as she approached the aircraft, checking tires, inspecting air intakes, running through pre-flight checks, left several guests unsettled. These weren't rehearsed gestures. They were ingrained from decades of practice. "This isn't right," Richard muttered as he filmed. "She moves like she knows exactly what she's doing." Murmurs spread as the recognition grew. This was no fantasy. Yet Thomas, blind with rage, barked new rules. When she failed, she would apologize on her knees and pay for every cost incurred. His voice cracked with desperation as the hangar shifted from laughter to unease, and the arrogance that once fueled the spectacle now exposed the beginning of a confrontation that could destroy him. Deborah stood her ground as Thomas Whitmore sneered and laid out his cruel conditions. If she failed, she would kneel, pay for damages, and publicly admit people like her didn't belong there. The air grew heavy with shame and unease, yet Deborah smiled, a calm, dangerous smile of someone who had just been handed the very fuel she needed. "I accept your terms. All of them," she said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that unsettled even Whitmore. Jennifer, the saleswoman, noticed Deborah scanning the aircraft's documents with the ease of someone fluent in their language. "Where did you learn aviation?" she whispered. "Honey, after 47 years of flying, you learn a thing or two," Deborah replied. The room froze. A black woman claiming she'd started flying in 1976, when even fewer doors were open, was no small claim. Thomas barked to move things along, but when Deborah addressed the crowd with pointed technical questions about flap landings in crosswind conditions, about saving lives through aviation, silence answered her. These men weren't pilots. They were buyers. She placed her hand on the fuselage, her voice steady. "I've spent 47 years proving I belong in the skies. Today, I'll prove it again." Climbing the access ladder, she stopped to deliver one last reminder. "I hope you have the transfer documents ready." Confidence radiated from her every word, shaking the room. Marcus whispered to his wife that they were about to witness history. Jennifer, shivering with recognition, knew real power when she saw it, and it wasn't in Whitmore's fortune. It was in Deborah's calloused hands. As the Rolls-Royce engines roared to life under her command, the hangar filled with a sound too precise, too perfect, to be a fluke. Her fingers danced over the controls with automatic precision born of decades in the sky. "This isn't right," Thomas whispered, fear cracking his arrogance at last. Jennifer, watching in awe, finished his sentence. "She's doing this as if she were a professional pilot." The hangar lights reflected off the polished fuselage of the Citation as silence hung in the air, heavy and reverent, while Deborah Williams stood as more than just a pilot. She was a living legend reborn. For decades, she had carried her story quietly, letting her mastery speak louder than her name, and tonight, against ridicule and arrogance, she spoke in the purest language of all: flawless skill. Journalists who had come expecting a humiliation now stood frozen, realizing they had stumbled into history, while Richard, who had mocked her earlier, wiped his eyes as his recording captured the impossible becoming undeniable. Jennifer whispered through trembling lips that Deborah was not just flying a plane but teaching them all how to live, and Thomas Whitmore, stripped of pride and crushed by despair, understood too late that arrogance had met grace and lost. As Deborah walked toward the hangar doors, her silhouette framed by the dawn sky, she did not look back, for her legacy had already taken flight again, not only in the records of aviation but in the hearts of every witness, and from that night forward no one in the city or in the skies would ever underestimate the quiet strength of Captain Deborah Williams again. The beginning of a transformation that would echo far beyond that hangar became a lasting lesson in respect, dignity, and the danger of underestimating the greatness that can reside in anyone, regardless of how they present themselves to the world. 6 months after that transformative night in Miami, the consequences of Thomas Whitmore's arrogance continued to ripple outward like waves on a calm lake. Richard Blackstone's video of the Millionaire's humiliation in front of an aviation legend had gone viral with over 15 million views, and Thomas lost $3 million in contracts when his business partner saw the footage. No one wanted their brand tied to a man whose prejudice and lack of character had been so publicly exposed. His reputation, built on arrogance and family ties, collapsed like a house of cards in a strong wind. Jennifer, the saleswoman who had witnessed everything, was promoted to regional manager after her recording became part of a documentary on pioneering women in aviation, and she often retold the story to clients, always stressing that true greatness never comes with a price tag. Marcus Stevens, the businessman who had once laughed at Deborah, became one of the strongest advocates for inclusion programs at his company, often telling audiences, "I met a woman who taught me that judging people by appearance is the costliest mistake anyone can make." Meanwhile, Deborah Williams was invited to deliver the keynote speech at the nation's largest aviation convention, where her story inspired thousands of young people, especially Black women, to pursue careers in the skies. The hangar where it had all happened was transformed into a training center that now bears her name, and when a young journalist asked Captain Williams what her most satisfying moment of that night had been, she smiled with the same calm grace she had shown in the face of humiliation and replied, "It wasn't when I proved I could fly. It was when I realized everyone present had learned a lesson they would never forget." As for Thomas, he was forced to sell much of his aircraft fleet to cover his losses, and in a twist of poetic justice, one of those planes was purchased by a foundation Deborah had created to train pilots from underprivileged communities. Sometimes, Jennifer reflected in an Aviation magazine interview, "Life has a sense of justice that surpasses any human planning. That night changed us all, but most importantly, it taught us that greatness can be hidden behind any appearance." The most powerful lesson of that night was not about aviation or wealth, but about the devastating price of judging people by their outward appearance. Thomas Whitmore learned in the most painful way that the true measure of a person is not in their clothes, bank account, or skin color, but in their character, experience, and dignity. Deborah never sought revenge. She simply allowed the truth to do its work. When someone chooses to humiliate another human being based on prejudice, they are actually digging their own social and professional grave. As Deborah often says in her lectures, the best revenge is to live such a full and meaningful life that your detractors realize how small their own horizons were. Today, when young pilots visit the Deborah Williams Training Center, they see not only one of the greatest legends in American aviation, but also a living example that human dignity is indestructible. No matter how many times others try to knock us down, we can always rise and fly higher than our detractors ever imagined possible. Thomas tried to break the spirit of a woman who had dedicated 47 years to the skies. Instead, he shattered his own reputation and discovered that some people are so great they cannot be confined by the small molds created by prejudice. Deborah's story teaches us that when faced with someone who tries to diminish us, the answer is not anger, but to demonstrate through our actions how wrong they were. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply to be true to ourselves, regardless of who doubts us. That night in the hangar proved that true humility comes from those who have real reasons to be proud, while arrogance often masks the insecurity of those who have never achieved anything through their own merit. If this story touched your heart and made you reflect on how we treat those around us, leave a comment sharing a similar experience you've had or witnessed. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how dignity always triumphs over prejudice. And don't forget to share this with someone who needs the reminder that outward appearance never defines our inner worth.